This is the old Harbour in Montreal, and this clock tower honors the Canadian sailors who served in the Great War. By the 1930s, the Great War was already fading from memory. In July 1936, the largest peacetime armada in Canadian history sailed for Europe. Its mission was to take Canadian pilgrims back to France for the unveiling of the Vimy Memorial, Canada's national memorial to its dead of the Great War.
More than 60,000 Canadians gave their lives for the cause which Canada had made her own.
I realized that we were blessed, really, to be able to go on the Vimy Pilgrimage.
It was to be the bittersweet swan song of the Great War generation. I'm military historian Norm Christie. I've been touring the old Western Front for 30 years. By visiting the famous and not so famous cemeteries and battlefields, you'll get a unique perspective on the war and the men and women who fought it on the Great War Tour. On November the 11th, 1918, the guns fell silent on the Western Front as the Great War ended with an Allied victory and the liberation of Belgium and France. 10 million had died in the fighting. At the outset of the war, Canada, as a loyal dominion of the British Empire, had been eager to join the fight. But the cost to Canada was enormous. 600,000 went to war, and 200,000 were wounded or killed. Now with peace, the veterans returned home to their families, fathers and wives and sisters and daughters anxiously awaiting their return. But as victory was celebrated across Canada, in every village and in every city and on every street, people were in mourning for the 60,000 soldiers who had never come home. This is the War Memorial at Harbour Collegiate in Toronto, and it lists the names of 48 former students who died in the Great War. Each name on the monument tells of a personal tragedy. This is nursing sister Carola Douglas. She was lost at sea when a German U-boat sank her hospital ship in June 1918. The funds for the monument were raised by private donations from family members and former students, and it was unveiled in a special ceremony in 1921. The entire community came out to honor the fallen. Harbour Collegiate was not unique. All across Canada, the communities felt the need to honor the Great War generation. And the statistics are staggering. At Harbour alone, 450 former students enlisted and 48 were killed. And the story was the same all across Canada. The nation was united in a desire to remember this unprecedented sacrifice. Canada decided to build a national war memorial on Vimy Ridge. Situated in northern France, the 7-kilometer ridge was the Germans' most fortified position on the Western Front. All 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps attacked together for the first time, storming the ridge on the 9th of April, 1917. Canadian infantry advanced under heavy fire, showing incredible bravery and discipline, and overran the Germans all along the ridge. It was here that the Canadians first burst onto the world stage with their great victory on Vimy Ridge. Out of the many designs submitted, the one chosen for the memorial was created by Toronto architect and sculptor Walter Allward. It was inspired by a wartime dream.
I dreamed I was in a great battlefield, I saw our men going in by the thousands and being mowed down by the sickles of death. And suddenly I saw thousands marching to the aid of our armies. They were the dead. They entered the fight to aid the living. Without the dead, we were helpless. So I tried to show this in the monument to Canada's fallen, what we owed them, and will forever owe them.
The huge monument, covering half an acre and soaring 30 meters into the air, was incredibly ambitious. It would be years before the generation of the Great War would see Alward's magnificent monument. For veterans and their families, Vimy was now far away, a distant, fading dream, while the anguish left by the Great War was here at home. This is Holland Avenue, just a few blocks over from Harbour Collegiate. The memorial at Harbour is a visible sign of suffering and loss. But across Canada, in every town and every village, there are invisible war memorials to the suffering and grief of the Great War. After the Great War, two brothers from this street returned home, and one of them, Greg Clark, wrote a story about his return in 1919. He lived here, number 66.
At the end of the war, my brother and I came back safe and sound. Joe was a flight commander in the RAF. He won the Distinguished Flying Cross. I was an acting major in the Canadian Infantry, and I won the Military Cross at Vimy Ridge. A party was held to celebrate our homecoming. The house was crowded, but amid all the gaiety and chatter, Dad took us aside. He asked us not to walk up and down Holland Avenue. You don't want the other families to see you. They've not been so lucky. Their sons did not come home from the war.
A few doors down at number 40, there is Lieutenant Cecil Perry. He was a top student and athlete and enlisted in March 1915. He won a Military Cross. He was 25 years old when he was killed in action. At number 9 Howland Avenue, there is Bill McMurtry, son of Archibald and Henrietta. He was killed in action in February 1918. And up the street at number 123, Ross Taylor, son of Wilson and Nancy Taylor, served with the Canadian Field Artillery and was killed in action January 1916. At number 17, there is Ken Bwist, son of Elizabeth Bwist. He served with the Canadian Engineers and died in July 1918. We know of 10 boys from this street who never came home. There were thousands of Howland Avenues all across Canada. The pain and suffering inflicted by the Great War was so intense that in the post-war years, the people had to forget. They had to forget so they could move on with their lives. The decade after the war became known as the Roaring '20s. People enjoyed themselves. The stock market boomed, and skyscrapers and tall buildings soared up everywhere. It was a wild time and a time to forget the war. But the Great War generation could not forget so easily. Many men were still suffering from the aftershock of war, wounded in body and mind. Some remained in institutions for the rest of their lives. Physically disabled veterans suffered from high unemployment, while other veterans returned to civilian life, but had to cope with the nightmarish memories of the war that haunted them. Meanwhile, the construction of the Vimy Memorial was proceeding very slowly. It was being built on a devastated Vimy battlefield, an area saturated with thousands of unexploded shells, making it impossible to remove the 100,000 yards of earth by using mechanical diggers. All the work had to be done by hand. The workers knew how careful they had to be, and yet 2 men were killed and many were injured before the task was done. The unveiling of the monument was still years away. As the construction went on into the 1930s, the wounds of the Great War were beginning to heal, and many veterans started to speak of their experiences. The Great War began to take its place in the popular imagination. In his best-selling book, All Quiet on the Western Front, adapted for the screen, German veteran Erich Maria Remarque described the horrors of the fighting in the trenches. Another Great War veteran, Canadian Will Bird, also wrote about his nightmarish experiences on the Western Front.
I seemed to be in an atmosphere rancid with stale sweat and breathing. Then, from overhead, the machine guns note, louder, higher, sharper, as it swept bullets over the shell crater in which I hugged the earth. The long-drawn whine of a coming shell. Its heart-shaking explosion. Then the first low wail of the man down with a blood-spurting wound. It was too much.
We're on Dundas Street in Toronto, just in front of the McLean Hunter building. It was built in the late 1920s during the great economic boom. In 1931, Maclean's commissioned Will Bird to go back to the Western Front and write a series of articles on what he found there. The series was known as 13 Years After. In Will Bird's series, he wrote about all the Canadian battlefields of the Great War, but the one that received the greatest response was the one on Vimy Ridge, and in particular, the construction of the monument there. It was to be Canada's national monument to the Great War.
The Vimy Memorial was the finest site of any memorial in France, the grandest, the most romantic. It is difficult to understand the magnitude of the memorial. 50,000 tons of masonry and concrete with reinforced steel were used for the foundation before the building of the memorial could even begin. 6,000 tons of stone were shipped from a quarry in Yugoslavia, across the water to Venice, and taken by rail from there to Vimy. Every stone had to be carefully tested to make sure it was flawless. Mr. Allward, the sculptor, is building greater than we know, is building for posterity. The veterans of the Great War and those that follow ever after will be proud that they are Canadians.
Will Bird's articles in Maclean's magazine were published in 1932 and were hugely popular. They brought the achievements and memories of the veterans of the Great War back to life. The monument at Vimy was being built to honor the men of the Canadian Corps. But before it could be completed, the man who had led them to their greatest victories, General Sir Arthur Currie, died in November 1933. His funeral in Montreal was a national event.
In front of the gun carriage, as the procession moves off, is a full military escort for the general.
It was broadcast on radio from coast to coast.
And for the last time, the devoted Corps commander is in the midst of his devoted men.
More than 200,000 attended the farewell, including thousands of veterans. The old soldiers of the Canadian Corps could see that their time was quickly passing, and the moment was right to celebrate their achievements. These are the Prince's Gates at the CNE in Toronto, and through these gates, 80,000 Great War veterans came to celebrate their war in August 1934. They had a secondary purpose for their celebration. They're also going to honor the memory of Sir Arthur Currie, the great general who led them in 1914 to 1918. The Canadian Corps reunion opened on August 4th at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. 16 years after the end of the war, veterans and their families thronged to the three-day event. Each veteran was given an Arthur Currie commemorative pin, and a carnival atmosphere filled the city with music and parades. The huge party spilled out onto the streets of Toronto. For 3 days and nights, the city was entertained by the men of the Canadian Corps. This is Riverdale Park overlooking the city of Toronto. And today it's a quiet, peaceful place. But on August 5th, 1934, 250,000 people came here for the climax of the Canadian Corps reunion. One of the keynote speakers of that day was Canon Frederick Scott. During the war, he was always in the front lines, sharing the dangers with the men and giving comfort to the wounded and dying. Scott was a legend to the men of the Canadian Corps. The reunion had been a celebration, a bit of a party. But on this day, the mood changed. It became an act of reverence, a memorial for their lost comrades. And from here, Canon Scott addressed his fellow veterans.
Where is the world that we fought to establish, my comrades? Where are those high principles which drew us, a mighty host, into the furnace of a war to end wars? In the world at large, a wild orgy of covetousness and opulence has been succeeded by unemployment, poverty, and even starvation. Then we look abroad. Mutterings of war fill men with anxiety. To you, the men of the Canadian Corps, I say, keep the bond between you sacred. And use the power that lies in it for the cause of the weak and the downtrodden, and the lives that still bear the scars of war.
The Canadian Corps pilgrimage to Toronto in 1934 was a tremendous success. It rekindled old memories and the sense of pride that the veterans had in their achievements. With the news that Canada's National War Memorial on Vimy Ridge was nearing completion, the veterans' cry was on to Vimy. This is the old harbor in Montreal, and today it's a place for leisure craft and Cirque du Soleil. But in 1936, it was a bustling industrial harbor, and it was also the place of the embarkation for the Vimy Pilgrimage. On July 16, 1936, 6,200 pilgrims from all across Canada and the United States congregated here to make the great journey to Vimy. Amongst those pilgrims was Iris Brown of Windsor, Ontario.
My father was a First World War veteran. He was an original. He sailed on the 4th of October, 1914, with the 2nd Field Ambulance and the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. I was very proud of the fact that he was a Canadian veteran and of his participation in the Great War. When the subject of a pilgrimage to Vimy came up, it was a very important part of his life. He was determined that we would go. So my sister Frances, my mother and my father, and me all went on the Vimy Pilgrimage in July of 1936. We had to go by train from Windsor to Toronto. We stopped in Toronto overnight. I remember being in the Royal York Hotel overnight and then on to Montreal the next day.
One of the pilgrims that had the least distance to go was my grandfather, Randall Christie. He only had to pack his bags, grab his bottle of scotch that he'd been given by his office mates, and head down here to the Quai Horloge.
I was presented an address book and a bottle of scotch by the staff, and wished a bon voyage. Left office at 2 p.m.
My grandfather enlisted in the Canadian Army Medical Corps. During the Battle of Vimy Ridge, he served as an ambulance driver. He was honored to go on the Vimy Pilgrimage. The send-off the pilgrims received was absolutely amazing. Half of Montreal came down to the docks to see the send-off. bands were playing the Great War tunes like Tipperary?
I can remember the paper streamers that were from the ship to shore, and I remember thinking, how on earth is the ship ever going to pull away from the dock with all of those streamers holding her together? We did, though. We left.
At 11 o'clock, the bells of old Montreal rang out, and the first tugs pulled the Montrose out into the St. Lawrence. It was then followed by the Montcalm, the Escania, and the Antonia. And the great pilgrimage to Vimy was on. Amongst those leaving was Harold Turner, a volunteer who served as an engineer in the Canadian Expeditionary Force that sailed to France in 1914.
A strange silence gripped the veterans as the vessels were pulled away from the docks with powerful tugs, as the memory of that other parting 20 years before rose uppermost in their minds. Our ship, the SS Escania, slipped into midstream, and other ships in the harbor dipped their ensigns in salute. The whistles of passenger vessels, tugs, locomotives, factories, all joined in a chorus, the likes of which had been heard on very few occasions.
Aboard the SS Antonia was Florence Murdoch, who was accompanying a widow traveling to visit her husband's grave.
My, what a send-off we had. It was a royal one, all right, but then our whole trip was along the same line. We had many high officials of the pilgrimage on our boat, including dear old Canon Scott. He was known to all as Pilgrim Number 1.
I can remember in the evening approaching the bridge at Quebec City and wondering how the ship was going to get underneath the bridge because the masts were so tall. Needless to say, I didn't have to worry about that.
The response to the Vimy Pilgrimage was outstanding. The Legion received thousands of applicants trying to get on the tour, and they restrict them to people who had fought at Vimy, fought in the First World War, or had relatives who were killed who had served there. So it was restricted, but they still got 6,200 people going on the tour as pilgrims, and in the end, each pilgrim was charged $160. This is an outstanding price, but you have to remember, it's in the middle of the 1930s. My grandfather was only a clerk in Bell Canada, so to save up that much money in the Great Depression to make this trip just shows how important the monument on Vimy was to him.
The pilgrims were all supplied with a Vimy medal. We had a blue beret. I think the veterans all had khaki-colored berets with a maple leaf on them. The people on the trip were very excited about going overseas. It was a trip of a lifetime for a lot of people. There were very few children on the Vimy pilgrimage. There were maybe 80 children out of the 6,200 pilgrims. We were with adults most of the time and had to behave ourselves. Dad got us up to the bridge. We went to the wheelhouse, which was sort of a no-no usually, but I'm not quite sure how he swung that one, but he did. That was another highlight of the voyage for me. I remember seeing icebergs floating by.
From the first, everybody spoke to everybody, and you soon felt you had known them always. We had all sorts of sports, dances, masquerades, carnival dinners, and the old soldiers sang from morning until night. The concerts were grand, as there was a great deal of talent aboard. We had a wonderful crossing.
After a week at sea, the 6,000 Vimy pilgrims reached the shores of Europe. 18 years after the end of the Great War, the Canadian Corps was back.
Glad to see land. Putting up flag again. River shelf calm, scenery great. Long day in river, about 3 hours from Antwerp. Weather fine.
I can remember as we were sailing up the river to the docks, seeing huge windmills on the shoreline. We arrived in Antwerp and disembarked.
Pilgrims on the SS Montcalm and Montrose landed in Antwerp, Belgium. The other 3 ships docked in Le Havre, France. The trip over for the Pilgrims had been leisurely, but with only 2 days to go before the unveiling of the Vimy Memorial, they had a tight schedule. This is the Cloth Hall in Ypres, Belgium, and today it's a great tourist center. And you can see the tourists at the cafes having a coffee or a beer and seeing the sights like the Menin Gate or the Cloth Hall. In 1936, 6,000 Canadian tourists came here, but they knew a different Ypres. My grandfather was one of those men, and the Ypres he served in 1960 to 1917, had been devastated. And when he got here, he couldn't believe what he saw.
Left at 8 a.m. for Ypres. Toured Ypres, walked all around. Wonderful change. Chimes of the cathedral played the maple leaf. Many of the places familiar to Canadians, at least by name. For here and again, time had wrought great change.
I particularly remember being in Ypres under the great arch of the Menin Gate. It's a huge arch, gray-colored. The names of missing soldiers are listed on the walls.
Around the city of Ypres, many battles had been fought during the Great War. 500,000 men were killed, and unceasing artillery fire had churned tens of thousands of dead men deep into the Flanders mud. And like the Vimy Pilgrims, Will Bird also visited the city of Ypres. He had fought there during the Battle of Passchendaele.
I stopped to chat with a local farmer. "How goes the farming?" I asked. "Well," he said, "the land is richer than before. It is the best land I've ever seen. My crops are the largest yet." All over those miles, you hear the same story. All that blood-soaked region seems doubly productive now.
Homeward bound, we passed a number of large burial grounds, and they presented a beautiful sight. So much so that our bus stopped. Headstones all the same, grass neatly trimmed, and each grave had a red rose in full bloom on it. As I stood, looking at row after row of these headstones, I was reminded of the poem by Colonel McRae. But I believe for the first time, the real meaning of those words came to me.
In Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders Fields.
It was here also that pilgrims got their first glance of a poppy. And soon after our buses stopped, the ground was cleared of all poppies.
300 pilgrims boarded trains to the French city of Valenceen. They were given a hero's welcome, much like the one they had received 18 years earlier when they had liberated the town from German occupation. This is Place de Canada in downtown Valenciennes, and today it's just a car park. But in 1918, it was something special. On November 2nd, 1918, the Canadian Corps had captured Valenciennes and liberated the people. 80 Canadians were killed in the action, including Victoria Cross winner Hugh Cairns. Cairns had taken many prisoners, taken out machine gun posts, and done incredible things on the battlefield. And it was collecting some of the German prisoners at the end that cost him his life. One of the German prisoners took out a gun and shot him after he had surrendered. Cairns was mortally wounded and died a few days later at a casualty clearing station. So he never would have found out that he won the Victoria Cross. This plaque is in memory of Sergeant Hugh Cairns of the South Saskatchewan Regiment, the 46th Battalion. It was dedicated during the pilgrimage by the 250 pilgrims who had been at Mons, who came down here amongst thousands of French locals. The mayor of Valenceen wanted to do something special for the Canadians, and he dedicated this street to Cairns' honor. What made the ceremony exceptional was they brought up Cairns' parents. What's moving about this tablet is it was the only one that was dedicated to an individual. Every other event on the Vimy Pilgrimage was to the groups, to the sacrifice of the Canadians. This one was to the sacrifice of Hugh Cairns. As the day for the unveiling of the Vimy Memorial approached, many pilgrims headed towards Arras, a city close to Vimy Ridge. This is the train station in Arras. This was an incredible day for them. The excitement, expectation was very high because everybody knew the city of Arras.
Arrived in Arras at 12:08. As we stepped from our trains, we were surprised as we walked through the up-to-date railway station. For as we remembered it last, it was just a mass of twisted iron and steel.
Arras was an important supply and transport center for the Canadian Corps. It was just a few miles from the German lines at Vimy Ridge, and over 4 years, it was constantly shelled by long-range German artillery. Its beautiful medieval buildings were destroyed. This is the War Memorial in Place de Marshal Foch in Arras, and you can see the damage from the Second World War. In fact, the train station was destroyed in 1944. But in 1936, everything was pristine. And when the pilgrims arrived here, they were received by thousands of cheering Arasois.
Military band met us at Arras at 12:16. Great reception. When we entered the square, we were confronted by large hotels, a large war memorial, and the city was bedecked with flags. We took buses and drove through the city, and we could see very little to remind us that a few years back, this city had been a complete ruin.
The cities of Arras, Valenceen, and Ypres lie on the old Western Front, where the Allies and the Germans had fought from 1914 to 1918. 60,000 Canadians had died in the fighting. Most of them rest in 700 war cemeteries along the old front line. Many are close to Vimy Ridge, where in just one day, the memorial was to be unveiled. During the Vimy Pilgrimage, thousands of pilgrims wanted to make special cemetery visits. 1,300 of them went to 350 sites across France, and each person had to have their own itinerary. And one of the cemeteries they visited was Regina Trench. These visits were very personal. They were there to see the grave of a son, or a husband, or a father. And they're always the most poignant part of the pilgrimage. This beautiful countryside was the bloody battlefield of the Somme in 1916, where 500,000 men lost their lives. It was just like this in 1936. And that was one of the complaints of the pilgrims. There was nothing left of the Great War, and the only place they could find the war was in the cemeteries.
We were in beautiful rolling French countryside, rich with harvests, showing an overabundance of rain. As one gazed over the miles of fields, it was most difficult to realize that this was the same country over which we had advanced and been so mercilessly shelled. Apart from the presence of war cemeteries, no sign of war exists. Our next stop was the cemetery which now contains Canadians, amongst which is my brother-in-law, who died of wounds received in battle.
Harold Turner's brother-in-law, Private Clarence Austin Nediger, was killed during the Battle of Amiens in August 1918. For many of the pilgrims, this would be their first and only chance to visit the graves of their old comrades and loved ones.
We drove by a lot of areas that Dad had mentioned over the years where he had been in battle. I can remember visiting cemeteries. When you see the cemeteries, you realize how many young men and young women, because there were nurses who didn't survive, what they gave up. They gave up their life. Yes.
For the pilgrims, their first days in Europe had been a whirlwind of events and cemeteries and memories. But by evening, they were back in their hotels and billets, anxiously anticipating the next day events, the unveiling of the Vimy Monument.
The unveiling of the Vimy Memorial was on Sunday the 26th, and it was an early start. We had breakfast, and then we boarded the buses to take us to Vimy Ridge.
Took bus to Vimy Ridge. Weather good. Passed through Neuville-Saint-Vaast and other familiar haunts. All land now tilled. Very few signs of war.
The pilgrims arrived in Vimy Park, 250 acres of land surrounding the Canadian National Vimy Memorial. It preserves the battlefield of Vimy Ridge of 1917 and still bears the scars of war, with shell holes, trenches, and tunnels, covered by a woodland of Canadian fir trees. Inscribed on the monument, there are 11,285 names of Canadian soldiers who were killed in France and have no known grave.
Then when we arrived at Vimy Ridge, we wandered through the reconstructed trenches. I think it was a very emotional moment for my dad, looking back. He had been there.
These are the old trenches on the crater line on Vimy Ridge. Vimy took so long to build that the engineers decided that they would do something with their spare time, so they cemented the old front line. So when the pilgrims arrived, July 26, 1936, they were discharged just outside of this site. They came in here, and it was quite miraculous because this is one of the few places where they could see something left over from the Great War. My grandfather was in these trenches in April 1917. This was his battlefield, and he could recount all the different places. This is where they evacuated the wounded. This is the battlefield they had gone over. After you went through the cement trenches, they went underground into the Grange, and that was really where he had been throughout April, May 1917, the undergrounds. Perhaps he even carved his name in there. Vimy was riddled with tunnels because that was the only way the soldiers could get to the front line and be protected from the incessant shell fire. The memorial was constructed on Hill 145, the highest point on the ridge, and which in 1917 the Germans had most heavily fortified and defended. The Canadians captured Hill 145 in a frontal assault with heavy losses and pushed the Germans off Vimy Ridge.
We were allowed to drive right up, all the Canadians, but the rest of the people had to walk in. We drove through those wonderful avenues of maple trees that have been sent from Canada and had our lunch with our companies in a woods near Vimy. All this ground has been given to Canada by France, and so is known as Canadian territory.
And there were thousands, not only the Canadian pilgrims, but there were just absolutely thousands of people from the surrounding area and visitors from other places as well at Vimy that day.
There are certain events in history that are very vivid, and for me, the Vimy Pilgrimage is one of them. You can almost feel the emotion of those times, the anticipation and the pride. And perhaps because my grandfather was here, it's a bit stronger for me. He came right down this path like I'm walking today, and he went over to the other side of the monument to get a special location. And everybody was waiting for the arrival of one man, the king.
I remember when King Edward VIII came up on the monument. He came in from the rear and then across the front. The veterans were all right in front of the monument, and everybody else was off to the side. There was a good welcome for him when he arrived at Vimy Memorial. He was well liked, and it was unfortunate that he did break a few hearts afterwards.
When the king came down here, one of the pilgrims standing here was my grandfather, and he snapped his picture. When he came down the stairs, the crowd pushed forward because he was a very popular king. He had served with the Canadians in the First World War, and he had a ranch in Alberta. He came to each different veterans group. He went to the amputees, he went over to the blinded soldiers, and then he went over to the war widows and the Silver Cross mothers. He met with Charlotte Wood, who was Canada's first Silver Cross mother, and she had lost 5 sons in the war, and the youngest, Percy, is on the Vimy Memorial. And then the king ascended the monument to unveil the spirit of Canada. Architect Walter Allward, who designed and oversaw every aspect of the memorial, placed at the very front of the monument the figure of a young woman. She stands alone, her head bowed, her eyes cast down. She is the young nation of Canada mourning her dead. The king stood right here. The spirit of Canada was draped with the Union Jack and the Red Ensign, and he started his speech.
In spite of the large numbers, there was a strange quietness noticeable, especially among the pilgrims. Minds were flashing back a few years, and the memories of those with whom we served and who gave their lives on this very ground came back to us.
The whole ceremony was a very subdued atmosphere. There was not a lot of chatter going on. Everybody was paying attention to what was happening on the monument. As children, my sister and I, we had to behave ourselves, and we did.
We raised this memorial to Canadian warriors. More than 60,000 Canadians who gave their lives for the cause which Canada had made her own. It is the inspired expression in stone, chiseled by a skillful Canadian hand, of Canada's salute to her fallen sons. For this glorious monument, crowning the hill of Vimy, is now and for all time a part of Canada. In that spirit, I unveil this memorial to Canada's dead.
During part of the ceremony, there was a fly past by aircraft. That was exciting. You don't normally see several planes flying in formation on every day, and it was something that you do tend to remember.
After the ceremony, a crush of pilgrims ascended the monument, and they swarmed all over it. Some just wanted to read names on the memorial, some wanted to lay wreaths, and some just wanted to touch it.
The monument was sparkling white, and the towering pylons. It is a gorgeous monument.
After the unveiling, the monument was thrown open for inspection, and this whole throng of more than 100,000 persons seemed to move in the direction of the monument at the same time, and there was a terrible crush. I was carried up most of the steps, and was glad when I reached the rear of the monument.
We hated to leave. The sky was just ablaze with color, and high on Vimy we watched until dark. Even then we hated to leave, as did every Canadian, and not many left until really very late.
I realized that we were blessed, really, to be able to go on the Vimy Pilgrimage. I really do feel blessed.
After the unveiling of the Vimy Memorial, the pilgrims visited Paris and London. They were greeted everywhere by great crowds and feted by dignitaries and royalty.
I think the highlight of our stay in London was the garden party at Buckingham Palace. And I can remember driving through the main gates, through the archway and into the square. We walked through the palace and outdoors right into the garden.
In August 1936, the Pilgrims returned to Canada. During the Vimy Pilgrimage, Canadian veterans paid their last respects to their dead comrades and came to terms with their past. But some demons of the Great War are not so easily laid to rest. Only 4 years after the Vimy Memorial is unveiled, another Great War veteran pays it a visit. Former German Army Corporal Adolf Hitler. Under Hitler's leadership, Germany invades Belgium and France in 1940. And once again, another generation of Canadians volunteered to go to Europe to fight. This is Canada Cemetery near Cambrai, and it's one of the cemeteries that was visited by a few of the Vimy pilgrims. For the pilgrims, their adventure had been a great success, but it had also been a bit of a failure. Their successes were that they had witnessed history in the unveiling of the Vimy Monument. They had been treated like conquering heroes, and they had got to say goodbye to some of their old friends and loved ones. The failure for the Vimy pilgrims was that it was clear that their time had passed, and it seemed that the world had learned nothing. The new times were moving quickly forward into a very dark future, a dark future that would be their worst nightmare, a future where their children would have to make the sacrifice. This row of graves is a Lancaster bomber crew, RCF Squadron 408, shot down over Cambrai in 1944. And this is the grave of Flying Officer A. Glendenning, navigator, Royal Canadian Air Force, killed in action over Cambrai, 13th of June, 1944. And the inscription reads, "Father, in thy gracious keeping, leave we now our loved ones sleeping." For the Vimy pilgrims, their children would have to pay the price. When I come back to the Western Front, I walk in my grandfather's footsteps, and I find that a little bit spine-tingling, that you can come back and go exactly where they went. You can't experience the same things because things have changed so dramatically. Today at Vimy, there's different types of pilgrims. Obviously, they're not the same ones from 1936. The connection then was enormous. Today, it's a distant thing. And of all the people who come here, they'll at least be impressed by the monument, even if they don't know the history. And maybe at some point they'll start to ask questions, whether they're little kids like this or whether they're high school kids or even adults. This is sort of the starting point to try to understand what happened to this generation.